directives we are having. Now, actually, what is difference between them? What are component directives? What are structural directives? And the attribute directives? Let's see. Actually, component directives already we learned. The purpose of component directive is to return markup. That means we learned components now. So the components are also referred as directives only. Because, for example, here in the index page, I am using app two-way binding. This is a component related directive which is used to return a markup, because when I access this, you can observe, when I access this, it is going to return this markup. So that means this two-way binding, it is returning that markup. That means it is used as an element. You can see directive is used as an element, and this element is actually returning the markup. It is returning the markup, right? So when we are using the element, it is returning the markup. So here component is also referred as a directive. So that generally we already used it. So how we accessed that component? When we created the component, the component is having a selector. This is actually the directive name. So it is having a selector. Right? Yes. It is having a selector. Now by using the selector, we can access. So that component is also a directive. So now no need to learn about this component directive anymore, because already component is a directive. So let's see how we can work with other types of directives and deal with the other types of directives, right? How do we work and deal with other type of directives? Let's take a look about that. How do we work with them? Generally, component directive is having an option to return the markup. And not only that, it is having a logic so that we can interact with it. Right. So we will see how to handle this component directive. So no need to explain any example on this component directive, because generally everything we used is a component directive till date, right? So the basic component directive we used. So technically, what is a component directive? So let's take a look. What is a component directive? A simple definition about that is component directive. So usually component directives, the component directive are the most commonly used directives, responsible for returning markup in your application. In your application. So a component directive, already we know a component directive can also handle user interactions. So by configuring the logic in TypeScript. So already we know that. So it comprises of presentation and logic. Actually, it is used to dynamically render HTML. Dynamically render HTML. So example, already we know, generally our directives will be like this. App hyphen home, that is, and usually it is built with, so home dot component dot html. Its logic is in home dot component dot ts, and its style is home dot component dot css. So it already comprises of all this. So component directives are the commonly used directives, and we already know about them and we are using them. That is what actually component directive is. Second, important, because later you will learn so many things about components, like a component inside another component, how to transport data from one component to another. We haven't finished it. We are just learning inside the component what else we can handle actually. So second important is structural directives. Actually, the main purpose of structural directive are responsible for changing the structure of view. That is what generally we call UI. A structural directive is mainly responsible for changing the structure of the view. That means actually the structural directive can dynamically handle any HTML component, It can handle any HTML component. So important is, it is responsible for adding and removing the components from UI.
Most people and most
Actually,
businesses can shoot a video like this.
are mostly
You'd agree,
responsible
right?
for
But what they can't
adding the components
do is stuff like
and
this.
removing the components. Adding, removing, removing, and iterating the components in HTML. So that is what actually do. So that means directive is responsible for adding the components, removing the components, iterating the components in HTML. That is the main purpose of a directive, the main purpose of a structural directive. I will show you what does that means, how we can dynamically handle them, right? So important, the Angular Structural directives are